Welcome to Restoring Black History, one gravestone at a time, and my journey to be enlightened by the truth. This is the Grave Truth. George Lark was born about 1866 and died in 1925 when he was shot by a Pasco County sheriff. That story never made it to the newspapers back then, but it was retold by the funeral home who buried him at Trilby African American Cemetery. George was married to Emma Reed, born about 1866 in North Carolina, and they had a son, Milton Lark. We don't know much about George and what his life was like. We also don't know the circumstances that led to the shooting death at the age of 59, but I have a little history on his son Milton. Milton was born on August 19, 1901 in Trilby, Florida, and died on Christmas Eve 1987 at the age of 86. He was a chef by trade and was married 3 times. His first wife was Alberta Adams of Dade City, married in 1921 when he was 20 years old. They ended up divorcing, and then in 1930, when he was 30 years old, he was married to Della, who was only 19. I'm not sure if he and Della divorced or if she passed, but he was married a 3rd time to Lula sometime between 1942 and 1945. Lula died in April 1968 in Hernando County, Florida. Milton had several children, but I'm only aware of Milton Lark Jr., who lived in Jacksonville at the time of his father's death in 1986. George Lark's further background of the people and circumstances from which he came are enlightening, to say the least, about the ways of life in the Deep South for African Americans, and how time and progress slowly paved the way for George, his wife, and their children. Now, since we know George was born about 1866 in South Carolina, and because we know that Emancipation Proclamation was effective the year before his birth, he may or may not have been born into slavery. I found that the only place in South Carolina where there were white and black people with the last name Lark living during the mid-1800s was in Newberry County. We begin by going all the way back to the mid-1700s, where John Lark, born 1758, and his wife Rachel, born 1755, are living on their plantation in Newberry County that runs along the Saluda River. In 1790, they have in their home 1 free white male over the age of 16, 2 free white female adults, 2 white females under 16, and 8 slaves. In 1800, we learn of John and Rachel's children: Elizabeth Rayford, Rachel Lark, John Lark III, Sarah Lark, Catherine Lark, and Mary Lark. At that time, they owned just under 1,000 acres of land in Newberry County and another tract of land in neighboring Edgefield County where John was born. 40 years later, in 1840, we find a Mr. A.L. Lark, also known as Andrew, living at the same plantation, which means he was a relative of John and Rachel's, either a son or a grandson. In this year, there are 9 white people living at home and 42 slaves. 28 of them are in agriculture, meaning 28 of them are in the fields harvesting crops, and the rest of them are domestic servants of some kind in the house, that sort of thing. Now, of his 42 slaves, 8 of them would have been willed to him by John and Rachel to continue in living and working there. In 1850, we learn who Andrew's family are. Andrew is age 50. His farm is valued at $25,000, which was very high back then. His wife Catherine is also age 50. His son Dennis is 19 and overseas, which implies he was in the military at the time. And then daughters Nancy, the initials SB, Ellen, and a son James. In the 1850 slave schedules, we find a list of 30 slaves named only by age, sex, and race that are now on Andrew Lark's plantation. So from here, after researching each of Andrew's children, his son Dennis got married and had his own smaller farm in the same county. In 1860, he's 29 years old with his wife, age 20, and 3 kids under the age of 5. He also has 11 slaves at this time, And again, they're only identified by age, sex, and race, never names. Now we have 2 white LARK families farming with slaves in the same county while raising their own families. What really ties all of this information back to our George LARK are the freedmen's labor contracts. After emancipation in 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau was established, which would help farm owners draft employment contracts that both they and the former slaves would sign. These contracts were designed to give freed slaves the right to continue to live on the property and work for the same farmer, but in return they now receive either shares of the crops that they harvested or compensation for their labor. However, these contracts greatly favored the farm owner, and it gave the freed slaves no choice but to continue living as they always had, working from morning till night under the rule of a dictator landowner who had all of the power over them. To these people, nothing really changed as far as a way of life, only that it gave them money in hopes of being able to be on their own someday. So both Andrew LARK, Dennis's father, and Dennis wrote freedmen's contracts for the slaves that were living on their property after 1865. This is the first time that the names of slaves are on paper, other than when they were written in a will. I transcribed Andrew's, and I'm going to read parts of it now. These said, Andrew L. LARK of the State and District do hereby bind myself to remunerate the services of all the freed laborers whose names are signed below, who have faithfully on their part perform all of the obligations of this contract by sharing to them 1/4 part of what may be and remain on hand at the expiration of the term of this service, upon of all crops of every description that may be raised and gathered on my plantation during the present year. The said crops, when fit for use, to be used in common for the feeding, support, and maintenance of all persons, animals, and stock, as heretofore on said plantations during the entire term of service, to house, feed, and care for them as I have heretofore done, and afford such medical attention as I can myself give, but will pay no physician's bill, including all old and infirm and young Negroes now on my plantation. I claim the right to enforce proper discipline, and will do so on my plantation, and said laborers must in every aspect be honest, obedient, faithful, and prompt in attending to all work assigned them, and must civilly and promptly attend to all orders, directions, and instructions given them by myself, my agents, or any of my family members, and to take necessary and proper care of all tools and farming implements, and to be kind and attentive and take good care of all animals, and are to be accountable at a fair valuation for all loss, injury, or damages to any and all tools, farming implements, and stock of every kind, which may happen, occur, or be caused on account of or by any inattention, carelessness, or negligence on their part. They must at no time absent themselves from my premises without permission by me or my agents or some member of my family, and any one of them who desert or leave my premises with intent to permanently absent themselves from my plantation, the shares of all of them who may so desert or absent themselves shall be forfeited by me. And then it goes on to say, we the undersigned freed laborers, whose names are signed below, do promise and agree to labor the aforesaid Andrew L. LARK from this day until the 25th day of December, next upon the terms and conditions expected and set forth in the above written argument. That entire contract was eye-opening to me. But in hindsight, what other option did they have? You know, if they were put out of the plantation, they had no money, no belongings, nowhere to go. They had no choice but to stay and continue living the way they always had under the title of freed people, but they weren't really, because they were made to stay on this plantation and do the work that they've always done. Now, as you can see on the second page, most of the slaves have the last name of LARK, and there is one named George on the list. I believe this would have been George Lark's father, because George was born the same year as this contract in 1866. So although he was technically born free, he really wasn't. Now, we don't find George again until the 1900 census, where he's living in Hernando County, Florida, as a lodger, which is someone renting a room in a home or a boarding house. He's 37 years old, single, and working as a woodcutter, most likely at a lumber yard or sawmill. We'll never know if George's parents ever broke free from the plantation that they were likely born at and worked their entire lives. But George certainly got out on his own, and by the age of 37, he was on his way to becoming a hardworking man and raising his own family on his own terms. With that said, he was living in a Florida small town that was definitely an actively segregated town. In 1910, we learned that George got married to Emma about 1901 and had their son Milton later that same year. But the best part of this census is that it shows that George owns his property. And in 1920, the status with him and his family and home ownership remained the same. George died in 1925, and there's a story that he was shot by a Pasco County sheriff. Unfortunately, there's no gravestone for George because he's one of more than 100 who are buried at Trilby African American Cemetery, where the gravestones and markers are gone. There's a video about that cemetery if you're interested in hearing about its history and the terrible condition that it's in now. Rest in peace, George Lark, and all your ancestors that came before you.